This talk, we're very lucky with this talk because it's really part of the Wandsworth Heritage Festival. So we've got double people coming to come and give us a talk. So I'm going to stop now and introduce you. And you are... Do you want to introduce yourself, or do you want me to get your name right this time?
No. Very happy to do self-introductions. Very clear sound?
Yeah,
All
good.
well? No. So you have a double act tonight. I'm Dr Joe Spence. I'm the master of Dulwich College. And I'm going to talk about the life and essentially the educational life of Canon Alfred J. Carver.
And our other speaker is
one of my
Nick.
predecessors. And then very much the times and the story of the social history around the period of Canon Carver's mastership of Dulwich College will be told to you by Dr. Nick Black, our Director of Admissions, Archives and Libraries. We think it will work well, given the way you usually operate, that we'll do a two-part talk, and there's a very natural break. I'll speak for about 25 to 35 minutes, I'm guessing, and then we'll have that tea break, and then Nick will pick up the story and talk for about that long again, and then we'll be very happy to take questions. I'll, of course, be very happy to take questions informally after my part of the talk. So we'll get underway with no more ado. So this is a story, therefore, of change in 19th century education, and particularly in the education in what were called at that time, no doubt, the great public schools. What a change there was between the beginning and end of the 19th century. At the beginning of that time, in one quote from an anonymous schoolmaster of 1806, the youth of Eton are dissipated gentlemen, those of Westminster dissipated with a little of the blackguard, and those of St. Paul's the most depraved of all. By 1906, that sort of reverence for school had become rather more the note. I want your school to be a kind of minor religion with you, ranked by the side of patriotism. Make it a sort of bond, a freemasonry between you and all who have been here, wrote Dennis Coke in his little story, The Bending of a Twig, 1906, a tale of honor regained in school days, not unlike the stories of the young P.G. Woodhouse, another alumnus of Dulwich College. So in 1800, I'd suggest education was about preparing for society. In these schools that we're talking about, it was about good manners and polite learning. Whereas by 1880, it was about godliness and good learning. Perhaps manliness and good learning would be another way to put it. Certainly that sense of a muscular Christianity being important. But also about networking. And that will be a theme, I think, running through something of what I have to share with you. But what we see at this time is the institution of something still, I'd say, very dear to us at Dulwich, and that is a classical education, a liberal education, perhaps a moral education infused by a high Victorian seriousness, is what you'll hear about when we talk about Alfred J. Carver. Of course, this is a story, therefore, of reform, and therefore notably of reforming headmasters. But the one that, when you talk about reforming headmasters of the 19th century and the early Victorian period, the person usually chosen to be spoken about is Thomas Arnold. But in all honesty, he was more a moral crusader, I think more aligned to the growth of revivalism in Low Church Anglicanism than really an educational reformer. He actually showed little interest in the curriculum, nor, against the popular image, the myth created by Thomas Hughes in Tom Brown's School Days, the story of Arnold's rugby, in games and in sport. Lytton Strachey perhaps was closer to sharply analysing Arnold in Eminent Victorians in 1918, when he saw Arnold as the exemplar of a public school system with an education based on chapel and the classics, with a damaging, as Strachey saw it, prefectorial system to maintain order. And I think there's an element of truth to that. The great book about the 19th century public schools is John Chandos's Boys Together, English Public Schools, 1800 to 1864. And he suggests there were four major reforms of the public schools in the mid-19th century. The broadening of the curriculum, something that I'll be talking mainly about in talking about Carver. the development of organized games as part of a strict syllabus, uniformity, yes, of dress, but of other codes, the coming of a codification of the life in the schools. And I suppose related to that, but carrying it further, and with that stress on prefects, housemasters, etc., social discipline and surveillance. And as Chandas reads it, in fact, Arnold was opposed in part to the broadening of the curriculum. He actually abolished science classes at Rugby in 1837. He was pretty indifferent to games, you would be surprised to hear, and to that codification and uniformity of things. But the clue to his reputation lies in that moral earnestness and that social order created by the culture of surveillance and the disciplining of boys by boys. His achievement was thereby to re-establish confidence in the public schools, which had become bear pits, essentially, and to put life into a moribund system. But really, apart from the replacement of dames running a boarding house by house masters and the special trust he put in senior pupils, there are no specific improvements that could be credited to him. But he did one more thing, which I think is what has really gained him his reputation. He was a headmaster who had his own school, the idea of the independent school, run by a person with a vision and with the authority to carry things through, was what he gave. And it was strengthening the morale of the public schools that he brought to the story. But perhaps he could thereby be blamed for slowing the development of a truly national system of education by breathing life into the old great schools and saying they can still work. Did he actually play his part in the delaying of a modernization of education, a liberalization of education? Chandas concludes that Arnold was really, in the end, a conspicuous public figure who dramatized life as the Christians' battle against sin. Catherine Chadwick writes, before Arnold, public schools were bear pits. After Arnold, they were bear pits, with the bear required to put in compulsory attendance at chapel. John Percival, one of Arnold's successors at Rugby, was also quite circumspect in talking about his achievements. He called him a great prophet among schoolmasters rather than an instructor or educator. The secret of his power consisting not so much in the novelty of his ideas or methods as in his commanding and magnetic personality. The young always respond to real conviction, and if it's conviction of the head and the heart, then you have a chance of carrying them through. But if Arnold was not the great reformer, who was? And I would identify for you, just before we go on to talk about Carver, a man at what was just a very modest country boarding school in the 1850s, who really began to have a great impact on change in education in the late 19th century, and that is Edward Thring of Uppingham School. There were 6 innovations that Thring brought forward. First of all, and most importantly, really to fight the challenge of the Clarendon and Taunton commissions looking to the reform of the schools, he set up the Headmasters' Conference, the belief that heads had something to learn from each other. Yes, they may have the autonomy of a Thomas Arnold, but it is worth sharing best practice. It's worth sharing ideas. It's worth knowing what we are doing well. And it was Thring, really, rather than Arnold, who brought to the fore in a school the building of a gymnasium and the creation of team sport as part of a balanced program of study. But it was not just that muscular Christianity and that sense of the team games as teaching moral discipline. He also introduced music into the curriculum. He introduced a London mission as community action for his pupils. And in a way, though I say this with caution, perhaps he was one of the first heads to really look at what we'd probably now talk about as an element of pastoral care. His great mantra was that every boy is good for something. These schools had tended to be scholar-led. Who is the best? Where can we get the best? And the rest existed perhaps in a rather Darwinian pond. And that idea of the seeking out of what each can deliver was very important to the story of Thring. But within our own world, we're going to turn to look at Dulwich and at the change that Carver brought to bear in what became Dulwich College. I think the saddest annals for the college are in the first half of the 19th century, when Edward Allain's noble idea of that school for poor scholars, that people would better themselves for education, go on to apprenticeships or to the great universities, had really fallen into decline. I say the worst days were the early 19th century, but in all honesty, Allain sets up his great school for 12 poor scholars alongside an almshouse and a chapel in 1619, and probably it had been the 200 years from the mid-1650s to the 1850s that had seen instead successive masters and wardens and fellows turning their posts into sinecures and holding down the poor scholars rather than advancing them. The master and warden were not required to be academic, but merely unmarried and with the name Allain or Allen. Whenever a vacancy arose, therefore, numerous bachelors of various vocations and professions named Allen or Allain came forward to apply. And this strange idiosyncratic system meandered on for 2 centuries. And by 1850, the press and the first school commissioners were demanding the reform of antiquated charitable institutions and endowed schools like this. And Dulwich College became a byword for its failings. Anthony Trollope in The Warden highlights Dulwich as a hotbed of peculation, of embezzlement. In the Dulwich Gallery, a chapter in Charles Kingsley's Alton Locke, 1850, and set in the late 1840s, the hero's cousin regales him on his way to visit the Dulwich Picture Gallery with sneers at the fellows of the college, their idleness and luxury, the large grammar school which they were bound by their charter to keep up and did not, and hints about private interests in high quarters, through which their wealth and uselessness had been politely overlooked, when all similar institutions in the kingdom were at last subject to the searching examination of a government commission. Dickens is pictured there speaking out against the old order at Dulwich, the misuse of the Allain Foundation, and seeking, in a place he loved, read Pickwick Papers, see his celebration of that pub he knew as the Dog, the Crown and Greyhound, which is still there. And in his speech at the Adelphi in 1856, he hoped to persuade people to change the funding of this charity, to move it from its misuse to looking after the children of needy actors who could benefit instead. But a new scheme does come, and that new scheme sees at last Allain's college, founded in 1619, transformed into something anew in 1858 by Alfred J. Carver. A new scheme for the development of Allain's educational foundation was in fact sanctioned by Parliament. The new act created a two-form school, the upper school providing a public school education, what was called a first grade education, a classical education for boys up to 18, and the lower school offering a middle-class secondary education for boys destined for commerce. Both schools initially were run by Alfred J. Carver, but within 25 years, it's Allain's College of God's Gift at Dulwich, and Dulwich College, as it became known, that would be recognized as a major public school, or perhaps more accurately, as a great London day school based on the public school model, but enhanced by academic innovations. Carver, who I'm pictured with here, there are pictures of Carver all over Dulwich. He is the refounder of Dulwich. I'm sitting at his desk there, returned to us by his family in the 1950s. Carver was the son of a philanthropic evangelical pastor from Norfolk, studied at St. Paul's and then Trinity, Cambridge, where he was a great classical and mathematical scholar. His prize-winning essays at school give a sense of the man who was to follow. They reveal an admiration for what our historian Jan Piggers has called the ideal polity of classical Athens and the moral and mental energy of Elizabethan England. Look at his prize-winning essays and you get something of the sense of the making of the man. The influence of the Reformation on the arts, literature and national character in England, delivered at St. Paul's in 1841. On the successive forms which the vindication of liberty has assumed in the social progress of Europe, delivered at Trinity College, Cambridge in December 48, and probably around the same time, on the causes to which the literary excellence of the Elizabethan age can be ascribed. That balance of classical Athens and Elizabethan England is reflected in the selection for the gallery of terracotta heads installed in the roundels of the new building of Dulwich College, 1866 to 1870, sages from antiquity and the Renaissance, together with later luminaries, Hume, Johnson, Byron, Macaulay, look down on the boys. But it's Socrates and Plato who look down from either side of the great door into Dulwich College. And Carver's own teaching was essentially Socratic. And what he pioneered, what I'd say he brought to the story of the reform of the schools, is what we today call, we still really call at Dulwich, a broad and balanced curriculum. He came to Dulwich from being Sir Master, Undermaster, Deputy at St. Paul's at the age of 32. And from the start, it was his ambition to create a public school to rival the great schools. The number of boys in his upper school, located in the old college in the village, of which you saw a picture earlier, rose to some 150, putting pressure on space. But fortunately, 2 railway companies offered to buy 100 acres of Dulwich estate land for their expanding networks. And with the funds that provided, the new buildings, designed by Charles Barry Jr., son of the architect of the Palace of Westminster, were opened in 1870. So 12 years into the 25 years of Carver's mastership. And by 1870, there was already talk that this school was becoming the leading middle-class school in England. Goodall wrote of the social interaction and transformation, whereby at Dulwich, quite uniquely, you had wealthy men who could afford to send their sons to Eton, availing themselves of the cheaper schooling of Dulwich, while poorer men are expending sums they cannot afford in qualifying their boys for admission. But what I love about the story of Carver is the story of Carver's syllabus for Dulwich. At his Dulwich were to be found chemistry, mechanics, natural science. The new college was to have one of the first chemistry laboratories to be found in an English school, and certainly soon afterwards, a physics laboratory too. In that story of Victorian headmasters, another that's often mentioned is Sanderson of Oundle. He was teaching, however, at Dulwich and took science to Oundle with him. Carver resisted the temptation to divide the college into classical and modern sides, which he called a partial bifurcation, which makes a boy specialize too young. Boys should not have to choose, he said, between Greek and German. He believed in what we'd call a sound liberal education and in identifying the right subjects for the boy rather than a shallow breadth of subjects. A boy can study art all day and in the evening go to lectures on science. He was the enemy of over-examination. And by stages up to 1880 were added to the standard Latin and Greek and divinity. English language, literature, and composition. What a lovely triumvirate that is. Language, literature, and composition for a school that so soon afterwards was to become something of a cradle of writers. The school of A.W. Mason, of the Four Feathers, of C.S. Forester, of P.G. Wodehouse, of Raymond Chandler. But there was also French and German and history and maths, and classes taught by specialists in geology and paleontology and anatomy and geography, design and vocal music. There was always strength in the arts, in drama, and of course in art itself. The top floors of the new Barry building were the drawing studios with natural light pouring into them. And under John Sparks, they really had the preeminent art teacher in the country, the man who was the teacher of Stanhope Forbes and many of those who went on to form the new Newlyn School of Art in Cornwall at the end of the century. Extraordinary lecture series were set up with professors coming down from the University of London, so that Carver, according to School World in 1891, was one of the first to see that the old exclusively classical training of the public schools was inadequate to the requirements of a modern changing world. And Carver himself spoke to this to his fellow headmasters. He was chair of the Headmasters' Conference early in its history in 1874 and gave a rather remarkable speech in defense of the study of the living languages. And something that's rather poignant in our own England of today. England must perforce avail herself of the services of refugees, of whom the continent sends on to hospitable England a plentiful supply of every rank and description. And the universities must take the living languages seriously, and then there will be teachers of them in the great schools. And of course, among the refugees, albeit only for a season, was Camille Pissarro, whose paintings of this part of South London are such an important part of his oeuvre. And there, Pissarro, always taken by the shock of the new, Crystal Palace, Lordship Lane Railway Station, the new Dulwich College, built in the very year of the Franco-Prussian War when he was in exile, and painted it, were important to his vision and capture something of this extraordinary new place set up by Carver. This place of lecture halls and of science laboratories. Carver didn't like the obsession in the public schools with a traditional hierarchy of disciplines. He believed every subject could have educational value. He opposed that specialization in learning and believed that to develop a boy's faculties on lines most congenial to his natural aptitude was what was important. And this was what was celebrated in a very interesting text, first published in 1865, and then in which Dulwich features prominently in its second edition in 1877. And that's Howard Staunton, polymath and only British chess master who could lay claim to be a world champion ever, examined the educational system of the empire in the great schools of England and gave Carver's Dulwich special recognition. He celebrated the potential of the English public school as against the centralized system of national education in France and the often excellent but loose system in Germany. He hated teaching by rote and neglect of science. A powerful argument in favor of science as a branch of education is that science cherishes the intellect and promotes the habit of observation. Books have inestimable value, but they're liable to overfeed the memory and famish the other faculties, said Staunton, who surveyed the ancient schools, Eton, Winchester, Westminster, St. Paul's, Charterhouse, Harrow, Rugby and Shrewsbury, and the new proprietary schools, Cheltenham, Marlborough, Wellington, and then added a special section on Dulwich. So convinced was he of the work that Carver would accomplish. He saw in the reconstituted college at Dulwich under Carver's leadership an unusually comprehensive scheme of instruction. The balance of teaching between upper and lower school, classrooms, lecture halls, art rooms, theatres, laboratory, teachers of living languages, drawing, music and science. Art and science, the breakdown of that awful sense of the two cultures that should be separated. Tradition and innovation brought into a happy union, what we at Dulwich today celebrate as free learning. And there's one other thing that probably Carver added to the story, a story that we're really now touching on touches of what you probably heard mentioned before as the invention of tradition. And that's the creation of old boys clubs and the tradition of sons going to the schools of their fathers. An old boys association was founded at Carver's instigation at Dulwich in 1873, so we celebrate its 150th anniversary this year. One of the first of its kind and called the Alleyne Club, now only as of last year, the only Old Alanian association. But also fast upon it came the Alanian, the school magazine, the colours system, the house system, debating societies, natural science societies, all of that sense of the breadth of education that could be so important. But it wasn't all plain sailing. It wasn't all as straightforward as I've made it sound. Carver did have a nemesis. There was a battle for Dulwich that went on between 1862 and 1882. And what I mean by that is that Dulwich of Carver was threatened by the arrival of the Reverend William Rogers as chairman of the board to succeed the Duke of Wellington in 1862. Carver's antagonist, as he became, had been made a member of the board on Prince Albert's recommendation. Albert had said that Rogers had done more than any man living for the poor and middle class education, founding new schools, including those which were to become the Central Foundation boys and girls' schools, still part of the Dulwich Foundation. And Rogers favoured the full weight of the reformed Dulwich schools being put not to a school obsessed with getting people to Oxford and to Cambridge and into the Indian civil service, but instead looking to give an education for more people from a wider range of social backgrounds. He wanted to revise the essential nature of the college into a school for industrial and commercial life, and planned to divert most of the funds from Allain's estate to schools in deprived London parishes. Rogers was the worst sort of enemy that Carver could have imagined, a powerful, well-connected man with a diametrically opposed ideal for the college, who came very close to sabotaging its success in sending boys to Oxford, to Cambridge, and in nurturing future public servants, academics, writers, and artists. Carver believed that Rogers was jealous of a school that was looking to rival his old school, Eton. I don't think there's truth in that. And there's something a little paranoid in the speeches that Carver makes late in his time at OA dinners, Old Elanian dinners, after his retirement, in which he always reminds his auditors that he gave himself to his battles in order to ensure that they had a first-grade school. In 1898, he said that a powerful body of men, both within and without the college, had insisted that the whole endowment of the estate should be devoted to schools of inferior grades, given that they did not want an Eton or a Harrow, to which Carver retorted, "Let me say, I do not want an Eton or a Harrow either, but a school greater and better and more useful than them." Carver carried his point, however, in the battle against Rogers in 1882, when under a new act, Dulwich College and Allain's School, which also now moved into new buildings, became two distinct schools under separate masters. And it must be said that Carver also did much for James Allen's Girls' School. He insisted that provision was made from the growing income of the Dulwich estate for the girls' school, and although he resigned as master when the new scheme came into effect in 1882, he continued, as he had been, a trustee of, and indeed ultimately chairman of the board of James Allen's Girls' School until his death. It could be said he did as much to establish JAGS as he did Dulwich College and Allain's School. But by 1882, Dulwich was holding its own in the great universities, and the number of boys being financially supported, often out of Carver's own pocket, to go forward to places there, or into the Indian and Home Civil Service, or to the Royal Military College of Woolwich, and there were many medalists of the Royal Geographical Society and prizes at the Royal Academy. You leave Dulwich not as you found it, a small and struggling school of less than 100 boys, but one of the greatest educational institutions of the century, was the tribute paid to him by his common room in 1883. And it has to be said, rather more generous than Carver was Rogers at the end of his time in his reminiscence, being generous to Carver in having said that the college had made great strides under wise management and great zeal. Carver's excellence was as an academic, as a thinker who went beyond that awful bifurcation of subjects that we've long suffered from in this country, in seeing, in a different way to Thring perhaps, that there is something in every boy to be found, in every pupil, and the best way to find it is to give that panoply of subjects that you can find your niche, your passion, your platform, the something that means something to you. He didn't, however, have that social vision of a Rogers, and it was left to his successor, A.H. Gilkes, to, I'd say, give soul to the college. Carver gave it a body, as expressed in those extraordinary Barry buildings that are still such a sight to behold today. But the soul was perhaps given by Gilkes, who, in addition to noble ideals of scholarship, really imposed a sense of public service that returned the college more to its foundational mission in a new form, notably in the setting up of the college's Hollington mission in a poverty-stricken part of Camberwell. But we have literally hit the dot of 8 o'clock, and I will stop for our tea break, and in part 2, in addition to this focus on the educational life of Alfred Carver, you will hear from Nick on the place and times of Carver. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. One of the comments that was made last September when the Queen died was that her prime ministers had gone from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. And the point was that obviously Winston Churchill was a Victorian by birth and in a sense by inclination, I think. And it's one of those things that I guess we forget about people when we look at them at the height of their career, is what they were when they began. And I think it's an interesting kind of insight into Carver, in that Carver was only 27 when he became master of Dulwich College. I think he has a unique position in educational history, in that he's the only headmaster both appointed and retired by Act of Parliament. So he became headmaster after the old Dulwich College Gosgift was abolished in 1857, and then was retired by the Dulwich College Act of 1882, which then made the college and Allain separate schools. So 27, and his father, Joe mentioned, was a Norfolk family and was himself a vicar, but a vicar who saw it as his job to preach to the condemned prisoners of Newgate Prison. So, and Carver himself went to St Paul's School. Obviously now it's in Barnes, but in those days it was pretty much next door to St Paul's Cathedral. So his childhood in that Dickensian world, we saw a picture of Dickens a few moments ago, was growing up next to St Paul's Cathedral, not far from Newgate, which still carried on executing prisoners in public until the late 1860s. And that was a kind of, as it were, the kind of experience that Carver had. And then to come to Dulwich at the age of 27 and to spend half of his career actually at the old college. So if you go to Dulwich Picture Gallery and you go through that sort of glass walkway from the cafe to the gallery, you walk past the rooms which would have been Carver's family home for the first 12 years of his time as headmaster at the college. And it was only halfway through that he came up the hill to create this new school. But many of the ideas he had were already, and the numbers were growing down at the old college. If you're going to create a new school, you need to have connections to give it a sort of legitimacy, if you like. And I think one of the things you're struck by, and I guess it's a feature of the second part of this talk, is in some ways how tiny these elites were that ran Britain, or even the subsets of Britain and the different kind of elements that made up mid-Victorian Britain. And these two pictures here, in a way, also capture something of the dangers of archives. So in these two pictures, on the left here, this is the prize giving for the first year that the college was up at the Barry buildings. And the person giving the prizes was the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. And this drawing, which is in the college collection, was drawn by I think, one of the boys. So it's not terribly good, but it captures the prince sitting down on this raised platform with the prize winners going up to collect that. And that sense of connection, I think, is really important. But it gives the impression, perhaps, that Carver sort of knew at that time the Prince of Wales. But in fact, and Joe touched on, the antagonism between the headmaster and the chairman of the governors meant that by the time this event took place, the chairman of the governors made sure that the Prince of Wales never actually met Carver. And in fact, as soon as the prize giving was over, the Prince of Wales was whisked off for cigars and cognac in one of the side rooms with the chairman of the governors, and Carver was left not invited in a room outside. The second picture, which is also in our collection, you can't see it in this, but if you look at the original in the PowerPoint, at the bottom it says that this is Carver, the Princess of Wales, Queen Alexandra. They're in conversation, and then just ahead of them is the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. But if you look at the buildings in the background, this can't be Dulwich, even though this is what the painting says that it is. And we're pretty sure it's actually Clifton College. And why we have it, no one really knows. And why it says it's Dulwich, we don't know that either. But it gives this misleading impression, I think, at one level, about the connections that they had between some of these people. But Carver was convinced that if he was going to establish Dulwich, he needed prominent people to come and to visit the school. Obviously, the Prince of Wales, well, you couldn't get much higher than that. Later on, the Princess Victoria, his sister, came with the Crown Prince of Germany, but they came by mistake because she thought that it had been founded by Prince Albert. In fact, she'd meant to go to Wellington and just came to the wrong school by mistake in 1887. But he did get to come to prize givings quite an impressive array of people, including people who accepted invitations to come, including Gladstone, at the time the Prime Minister, unable to come at the last minute because his government had fallen on the morning of prize giving, and he had to decline the invitation at the last minute. But if he's going to make Dulwich this world-famous, well, certainly British-famous school, then bringing in these people and connecting the name with academic excellence and prizes was going to be something that was very important. So when he became the headmaster, the Dulwich estate, these about 1,500 acres that had been left to the college when it was founded in 1619 by Edward Alleyn, was still farmland, or just about farmland. And in where the college buildings are now was where the Dulwich Windmill was located, just opposite the pond, which is still there. But by the 1850s, that was beginning to change, and I cycled over the hill from Dulwich to come here, and you suddenly, as you came down towards the Dulwich Streatham High Road, you're hit by this kind of range of Victorian villas that marked out the march of the bricks through what became southern London from the 1850s, 1860s onwards. And it was that change from kind of rural Dulwich that still had cows and meadows to essentially an urban Dulwich that was the making of the college that Carver built. And you can see on this map, they've marked out railway routes in red. You can see this bit of line was actually built going through, which is the West Dulwich line going down to Orpington. And then this other route, which in fact was never built, which is going to loop round through the woods and land up at this extraordinarily important building, actually in the Dulwich story, which is the Crystal Palace, which is just located here, the very southern end of the site. So this is Denmark Hill up here, Lordship Lane, Sydenham Hill, and then Croxted Road down here. And it was the development of housing on these estates, the development of the railways, and the development of the Crystal Palace, that were these three things that made the Dulwich story possible, and these extraordinary buildings that Charles Barry built, financially viable from the small buildings that Joe had mentioned earlier, which had just 12 boys. So I'd say there are these kind of three things that kind of change the kind of Dulwich area, well, South London, and one of them is the arrival of the Crystal Palace. So originally erected in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition 1851, then rebuilt on Sydenham Hill in 1854 on sort of twice the scale of the original building in Hyde Park. And essentially, I remember a colleague described it as a visual encyclopedia. So the idea is that you arrived at the bottom, at the southern end of the site, near Penge, where the dinosaurs were, and there was an explanation of geology, and then you worked your way up through the park to this pinnacle of human achievement, which is the Crystal Palace. And inside it was a sort of history of human civilization. And this drew huge numbers of people to come and see it, and people wanted to live near it. So here you can see, sort of going down the hill, what became sort of Barryville, Charles Barry building many of the houses, and the railway station, which you can just see just here in the corner, the upper higher level station at Crystal Palace, were these big houses. And this brought kind of wealthy people to Dulwich area, and at the very top, left-hand corner of this photograph, you can see the playing fields of the college. It's one of those things I've never found is a photograph of both the Crystal Palace and the college buildings in the same picture. Always hope one day it'll turn up. And people not only came here, but also Carver used the people who gave talks and things in here to come down to the college. So it was absolutely a sort of essential to this kind of modernising of education in the Dulwich area. And particularly if you bought a house or leased a house on the estate, you were given reduced fees at the college. So it also encouraged the local families to send their children, their boys to the college. Thank you. I found this photo just recently, and in a way it kind of encapsulates, I think, something of that kind of mid-Victorian London, and particularly this extraordinary family, the Barrys, who are involved in the building of so many parts of central and south London. In the background, you can see the Houses of Parliament, which Sir Charles Barry built after the fire of 1832 with Pugin, and his son, Charles Barry Jr., worked with his father on those buildings. And then in the foreground of this photograph, you can see the college buildings. And this picture was taken probably from the roof of the Crystal Palace some point in the late 19th century. And again, this idea of, the march of the bricks. You can see the houses going up in South London, lots of treed areas around Dulwich itself, which are going to provide the children who are going to come to these schools. And this is the second of the Pissarro pictures we were going to show you this evening, looking down, looking west, so probably in the very far distance you've got Streatham. The sort of cream-coloured building in the sort of centre of the kind of opening of the trees is the chapel at the centre of West Norwood Cemetery, which doesn't exist anymore. And then in the foreground, these are the villas of Alleyne Park. And obviously in the foreground, you've still got countryside. And it's that sense of this changing dynamic of this part of London, which I think this picture captures, painted in 1871, and of a train obviously coming through the cutting between Sydenham Hill and West Dulwich Station. And it's these villas and this development here which is going to provide the children for the school, and I think make a difference to obviously the feel of South London. So Carver had essentially three homes. He lived in the Old College from 1858 to 1871, and then he when the Barry designed those buildings, you saw them in the floor plans that Joe showed earlier. In fact, part of the buildings were given over to staff accommodation. So in the North Block, which is now next to South Circular, some of the undermasters lived. And then in the South Block, where Joe now has his study, which is the last remnant of this, the master had his house. And it covered about 4 floors of the building. And he lived there up until 1883. And then when he retired, he moved to Sydenham. And this was the card that he sent out on he and Mrs. Carver's golden wedding in 1903. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner the name of his house, which was on Streatham Common, Lyndhurst. And we'll come back and say a bit more about that shortly. And that house was designed by Barry. So it's interesting, because if you read the books, it often says that the relationship between Carver and Barry was an acrimonious one. And certainly, I think Carver probably would have wanted certainly a cheaper building, although, as Joe said, he took quite a sort of key part in the designing of the ornamentation of the faces, the roundels on the building and who they were going to represent. But he then chose Barry to be the architect of his house in Streatham, so which suggests perhaps the relationship was a rather more cordial one than perhaps sometimes you might guess at. And the other thing I was just going to say is there's a list of his children there, one of which was called Arthur Wellington. And one of the sadnesses probably of today's education is that headmasters no longer name their children after their chairman of governors. So when Carver arrived at Dulwich, the second Duke of Wellington, not the Waterloo one, his son, was the first chairman of the governors of the college. And obviously, I think they had a very good relationship, and obviously he named one of his children at least after that person. About 25 years ago, I went on a scout camp with the college down to Devon. And usually in the middle of this camp, which is the boys do the cooking, so you can imagine what it's like, there was an afternoon off, which usually involves trying to get sort of decent sort of tea somewhere. You went visit something, and I went to Castle Drogo, which you might recognise. It's an amazing Lutchins building. It's not a real castle. It was built essentially at the end of the 19th century through to the bits that were finished after the First World War, but largely it's the end of the 19th century through to 1914. And it was built by a man called Julius Drew, who was a sort of Sainsbury's or Tesco's of his day. And I'll say a bit more about him in a minute. And going round the the rooms, in one of the sort of guest bedrooms, there was a photograph of Canon Carver. So I asked the sort of National Trust lady why there was a picture of Canon Carver in this room, and she didn't know. And it's something that's kind of was at the back of my head for about 20 years. And I looked up, were there Drew boys at the college? Where there weren't. The one who's commemorated in the building is his eldest son, who went to Eton and was killed in the First World War, and he kept the boys' bedroom as this kind of time capsule to his lost son. That's probably why the building was never finished, because he sort of lost interest in the project. But what this kind of thing at the back of my head did was, in thinking about this talk, was you suddenly make connections, and you make connections which explain something about Victorian Britain. Carver married into the Peake family, and you may have heard of them because most famously they made biscuits, but that was one branch of the family. Originally they were tea importers, and they were one of the biggest tea importers in the country. And Francis Peake, who's in the middle of this family tree and who's Carver's brother-in-law, had a massive house up on Sydenham Hill, and was involved, and this I think is what's interesting about the development of South London as an area, in both interested in education, so building of schools, but also in the creation of Dulwich Park. So he campaigned for about 20 years and negotiated, might not be quite the right word, with the Dulwich estate for them to release the land so that there could be a park at the centre of Dulwich as it developed as an urban area. And another of slightly more distant cousins, Sir Henry Peake, was an MP for Wimbledon, lived in Wimbledon, and the thing that connected these two cousins was that they were both involved in the preservation of the common land of South London, where they could. And Henry Peake took on Lord Spencer to try and save Wimbledon Common from being developed as a housing area. And Francis Peake was involved in I say, the creation of Dulwich Park, even though the Dulwich Common itself had been given over to the land for the college buildings. And this is Victorian commerce. So you've got the biscuit makers and the tea makers who then marry into the Drews, who owned a chain of shops called Home and Colonial. I think it disappeared in the early 1970s. And it was the money that the Drews made from Home and Colonial, as you can see, selling tea, that the Peakes had imported, that paid for Castle Drogo. And therefore, it must have been Uncle Alfred going down there in his retirement days when he was a very old man, because there's only a few years between the building of Castle Drogo and when he died in 1908, when he would have been down there maybe for his summer holidays or something with his wife, and therefore Julius Drew was his nephew. So what I think it shows you is this really very small elite of commercial Britain that marry into each other. It was the money that came from the Peakes that essentially kind of paid for Carver's lifestyle. And often he gave money to the boys for prizes or scholarships. These weren't funded by the estate, they were funded out of his own personal pocket. And also then for often increase in salaries for some of the teachers as well, which the governors wouldn't agree to. So I think it's a really interesting view. So they've got William Peake over in Wimbledon, Francis Peake in Dulwich, and then Alfred Carver connected to them as London developed, this part of London developed in the latter part of the 19th century. Thank you. And then when they died, many of them were then buried in West Norwood. They are some of the tombs that survived the clearance of the 1970s. And these two pictures come from the Castle Drogo collection of the Peake family. So there was obviously very close connections between the Drews and the Peakes, that they kept the family paintings there. As I say, when Carver retired in 1883, he moved to Streatham, and here's a map showing the location of his house. So on the bottom of the picture, you can see Streatham Common. And so the road heading down to the high road here, so Sainsbury's will be about here in the picture. And then Liam Court Road, here are the houses going off to the top right-hand corner. And on the very corner of that, you can, I'll point to it, that was Carver's house. As I say, designed by Barry. Mark very kindly sent me a photograph of it, taken, I think, from the common, looking across on that junction of the road. Very typical, I think, of a lot of the detailing of a Barry building. He also sent me a couple of pictures of the garden front as well. And he was living next door to Henry Tate in a much bigger house next door, which is obviously still there. Carver's own house was knocked down, I think, in the 20s or 30s and has now been replaced by a block of flats, which I think is called Benhurst, I think, which you can see on the corner. There's a couple of the houses that you can still see as you go along Liam Court Road, giving a sense of the grandeur of this bit of Streatham at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. I thought I'd mention something that I think connects not necessarily Carver, but the college to this part of London. So in 2018, we launched this website which looked at all the Old Olanians who died in the First World War. And there were 536 of them. Very few of them date from Carver's time. They were generally too old to have fought, and almost all of them were at Dulwich College during Gilkes's time, who was headmaster from 1885 to 1914. But you get a sense of this area. So what we did is we mapped both where these Old Olanians were either killed or buried or memorialised, on say, the Western Front in particular, but also went back to the old fees ledgers to find out where they'd lived when they were boys at school. Because I thought there's an important thing for our boys in Year 9, they do a project on the First World War, to understand something of the kind of social history, if you like, of this area. And Dulwich was unusual. It was a very big school, but it was also a day school. So most of these 536 Old Olanians lived very close to the college and would have come in either by bicycle or on a tram or on a train or walked. And this just gives you a flavour of this particular area. So you can see Dulwich Common at the bottom, Liam Court Road going off just off the centre, up to the top right-hand corner. And I thought one in particular might interest you is Second Lieutenant George Pratt, whose family owned a department store on the High Street, which you may remember, became part of John Lewis, and then closed, I think, in the early 80s, something like that. But essentially these people, the average age, I think, when they died was about 22, although the youngest was 16 as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. And one I just mentioned, because he lived on Liam Court Road, is called Frank Clark, and he's buried in West Norwood Cemetery. So if you're going there, and I'll come back to West Norwood Cemetery in a minute, you'll see his grave is there. And he is this one. Frank Clark was 18 when he died. He joined the Royal Flying Corps and got his wings, and I think to celebrate, although I can't prove this, but I suspect it's true, like I'm a history teacher, so often you have to make things up, use imagination, I think, to make logical and likely connections, is I think he wanted to fly over his parents' house to show that he had got his wings. And the plane caught the top of the chimney pot and crashed in the street outside and caught fire. And his dad ran out of the house and pulled him out of the flames with his walking stick. And Clark, I think so, sort of stunned by what had happened, actually turned around and walked back into the flames and was pulled out again, and then died that night at home. So I thought, it's these stories, I think, connect, they resonate with the kids. And there's a lot of newspaper coverage of that particular story, which you can see on this website. But if you want to have a little look, see if there's somebody who lived on your road, then do have a little look at it. We've had lots of feedback from people. But one of the really difficult things, and I guess this comes back to the Lyndhurst-Benhurst thing, was often they lived in houses which had names, not numbers. So it was really hard trying to work out where these houses were on these streets. Most of these houses have now been demolished. To get a sense, so we could try and pinpoint them correctly. So even if it's not your house, maybe you live on something that was on that site. And we try to be as accurate as we can, but if you find any errors, please do let us know. So Clark's buried in West Norwood, and when Carver died, he too was buried in West Norwood Cemetery, very close to the what was the Anglican chapel, which doesn't exist anymore. It's pulled down just as a result of bomb damage. And as I say, this is an image of him, I think, at the end of his career at the college in 1883. But in 1908, there was obviously, as Joe said, this great kind of reverence towards him. And this really interesting school, this mixture of things, subjects and things that he created. And one of the things that they created as a memorial to him is in the chapel, in the old college down next to the picture gallery, which is this reredos, which is named after, in memory of Carver. And it captures, obviously it's the wise men arriving to Jesus. But one of the figures in the bottom right looks very, very like Edward Alleyne. And rather than having necessarily kind of lots of shepherds, there are two Dulwich schoolboys either side, one holding a cornflower, which was allegedly Edward Alleyne's favourite flower, although it wasn't. But it was again, this invention tradition that Joe mentioned was part of that creating of a sense of the kind of canon of Dulwich stories. And then the boy on the right carrying a little model of the chapel on the right there. So if you do get a chance, it's quite often open. They have concerts there on a Wednesday lunchtimes during term time when the various schools put on concerts there. So do go and have a little look. But I'm going to finish there, and thank you very much for listening. Cheers.
Thank you.